and he's going to help us understand better about how to plan effectively for industrial and logistics floor space. So Mark, if you'd like to give us your presentation, thank you.
Thanks, Penelope. I'll just get the slideshow going. Yeah, just a bit of background for me. You know, my main role at kind of Savills is I sort of lead up our sort of market assessment department. So really looking at sort of what are the future commercial needs for different land uses, industrial logistics being one, but also office, and obviously, you know, others in the team such as Ryan, who'll speak later, specializes in R&D and tech and other kind of sectors. I'm actually an MRTPI planner. I used to be a policy manager at a local authority in London. I've also worked for the Greater London Authority and the London Development Agency when that was around. So, you know, started off as a planner. Now I still think of myself as a planner, but I'm also a property economist now, sort of trying to understand what are the needs of different commercial uses and how we can get those arguments into the planning process. So I'm here to talk about industrial logistics. Before I dive into that, obviously people will see these increasingly large boxes or sheds, whatever you want to describe them, up and down our major motorways. I'm going to talk about a little bit, you know, what actually is the sector that go beyond these buildings. I think the first thing is, you know, to me, yes, they are classed as a land use in planning, but they really are critical national infrastructure. And what I mean by that is our freight networks, which are effectively our major motorways and roads, our ports, our rail freight airports, our strategic rail freight interchanges, none of that infrastructure works or connects without these premises. Our manufacturing premises, our logistics warehouses, all of that infrastructure doesn't work without these premises. So in my mind, it is part of this view of critical national infrastructure. You know, and because of that, you know, it really has a large economic footprint. You know, industrial logistics. So I use the term industrial logistics, which is manufacturing, light industrial, and logistics sort of grouped in together. Those, you know, this sector sort of employs about 3.9 million people in England, massive GVA contribution. It basically represents about 14% of the English economy in GVA terms. But I think actually one of the things that's probably not well known about it is this word productivity. Now, obviously, that's a very economist kind of term, but one of the major economic challenges we have in the UK is our labour productivity. So that's, you know, what is the value of our day-to-day operations as workers? And as you can see in that sort of left-hand chart, the UK's labour productivity basically trails every other major economy in Western Europe. And we've really sort of struggled coming out of the global financial crisis. Our labour productivity is stalled. And there's a lot of things for that behind that. UK businesses don't really invest or haven't really invested as quickly and as robustly in technology and their future than a lot of other European businesses. We've got a lot of really, really small companies in this country that, you know, don't again invest a lot in tech and those kind of things. And then, you know, there's other things political that probably haven't helped either. So, you know, one of the big challenges we need to address is increasing our labour productivity. And that's really important because the more productive an economy it is, the higher salaries it can pay, the more salaries, the more tax receipts, which can go into critical things, hospitals, schools, infrastructure. So it is a really key sort of metric that we need to address. And logistics, industrial logistics can play a major role in that because it is actually one of the most productive bits of the economy. So obviously when we improve our labour productivity, we should facilitate the growth in the most productive bits of our economy. Industrial logistics is very much part of that. So its productivity is predicted to grow by 29% over the next decade and a half, where the economy as a whole is only 18%. So, you know, just giving a bit of a macroeconomic feel for how big this sector is and how important it is to the economy going forward. So, you know, obviously, again, going back to this point, yes, they're big buildings, they're very regular in shape. And I think it's fair to say things like, DBT, sort of the parcel carriers, Amazon, Tesco's, all these big companies, and sort of more dominate the kind of media attention in this sector. But this sort of graph here is showing you, it is a very, very diverse sector. The businesses that go into these kind of warehouses and factories can be anything from an advanced aerospace manufacturer to a retailer, delivering our groceries, to everything in between. And as you can see, it, obviously in terms of broad sectors, transport and warehousing in yellow is a big proportion of it, which picks up the Amazons and all these others. But you've got a lot of retailers in there that have been moving their operations to more online. There's manufacturers in there, there's professional and scientific companies, there's wholesalers, and there's even a significant proportion of those in accommodation and food services. So it is quite a diverse sector. Whilst there's only a few companies that might dominate kind of the airwaves, it is an extremely diverse sector in terms of the businesses that go in there. So it's not only the businesses that are extremely diverse within the industrial logistics sector, but the sorts of premises that are needed. If I'm a small company who is making school uniforms, I might need a 5,000 square foot small shed somewhere, or if I'm a large national player, I need something that's 500,000 square foot and hundreds of meters long, right on a major motorway junction, and you've got everything in between. So these premises are very different in their size and their height and their scale and where they need to be located, but they're also very different in terms of what role they play in the wider supply chain. So you've got the big national distribution centers there in the left, very, very big, wide on a motorway junction, need to be connected to ports and rail infrastructure because that's a big part of their supply chain. Everything down to micro hubs which could be some very small sheds in an urban location. And then you've got everything in between. So the way it generally works, got national distribution center that will then send kit out to regional distribution centers, and that will go out to last mile, which are closer to the end customer. Now, end customers, not just us as homes, it's also businesses as well. It's hospitals, it's all those kind of things. So obviously it's a very diverse sector in terms of occupier. It's also very diverse in terms of the size and the location of the premises which are needed. Obviously, I think there's a lot of, this is a design focused group, and, as someone that is fully embedded in this sector and understands its worth, there is a lot that has to be done in terms of the way they present, how they're designed. And I see a lot more now in the projects that I am with the architects and the designers really trying to get these buildings right. So they are starting to really evolve. 20, 30 years ago, it's probably fair to say they were quite grotty functional buildings with not a lot of thinking about how they interface into their wider area and the character of where they're located, to now you have a lot more office co-location within them. Now you have a lot more sort of wellness facilities, outdoor facilities, trim trails, meeting spaces. So there's a lot now, and a lot of these buildings now are trying to, a lot of the big players that are building these buildings are now sort of signed up to the well building standard. So it's really this more human-centric approach to the design of these buildings. So, I think there is moving, and I think, a lot of you here would be looking at the design of these buildings and are being part of that evolution. The sector it is a big part of improving the ESG credentials of England and the UK. There's a lot can be done with the roof space and buildings that, with solar, they could contribute to 25% of the UK's power requirements. I'm working a lot of schemes where they are trying to be self-sufficient. So there's a lot of ESG driven sort of investments and parameters that are trying to reduce on-site energy requirements, but also wider as part of the supply chains, electrical vehicles, hydrogen, all of these things. But I think also beyond that, planning also is a big part of making sure these things are in the right location. They're on motorway junctions on the outskirts of major conurbations rather than being 100 miles away, is all part of sort of reducing and improving their ESG requirements for these buildings. So we released a report a couple of years ago called Leveling Up the Logic of Logistics, and we put a lot in there about how this sector needs to and is starting to sort of respond to the increasing ESG agenda. Location is absolutely critical for the industrial logistics sector. I mean, that diagram on the left is, I know it's very busy, but we basically just plotted every rent level that's being paid that we can get our hands on for every building up and down the country. And then we plotted that in relation to some of the major conurbations, which are shown there. And then basically what we can basically see, which is on that chart there on the right, is that basically the rental premium. So this is how we would gauge how important location is to an occupier and investor. They will pay more. So if you're within 5 kilometers of a major conurbation, you pay 55% higher rent than the national average. And that kind of premium reduces the further you move away from these major conurbations. So it just shows how crucial location is. So basically, you know, most occupiers will pay 55% more to be closer, because even though they're paying 55% more rent, that is going to save them a lot of money if their trucks and their LGVs traveling greater distances to get to their end customers and link with their suppliers. So location is absolutely critical to this sector. And this is more the same. So, you know, this is again showing there's also a very significant rental premium for sites located within 2 kilometre buffer of major motorways. So those black lines there on the left-hand chart, so the major motorways in the UK. So these are the bits of road network that handle over 100,000, over 10,000 HGV and LGV vehicle movements per year, per day. And then obviously then we've got a rental premium to how much higher rent businesses will pay in relation to motorways in the different regions of the UK. So, you know, location is critical. You know, being on these major motorways, proximate to major urban conurbations, significant rental premiums are realised. And again, just sort of finishing up, you know, understanding a little bit about the sector, what it's about. I think it's interesting, you know, I do a lot of office schemes and I'd love to do more, but offices, that sector is really sort of facing a lot of structural issues at the moment and isn't going well in terms of its demand profile. A lot of that is a lot of us work from home now. So basically we're office at the moment, 75% of new office investment in the last 5 years is in just 10 locations. Whereas industrial logistics, you got any urban conurbation, a decent mode network, you will have a market for industrial logistics. So you can see those yellow lines are a lot more distributed up and down the country. So a lot more areas can share in the growth of this sector because it is the fastest growing and strongest commercial sector in the UK, and it has been since the global financial crisis. But that kind of investment is a lot more wider dispersed than it is for office. I mean, office effectively goes London, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Cambridge, Oxford, you know, and not many other locations outside that, Glasgow, you know, so, you know, 75% investment, just 10 locations, INL a lot more distributed up and down the country. And just sort of finishing off about understanding the sector, you know, this is probably not known so much, but in the last 10 years, you have a lot more office co-location within industrial logistics premises. So that's what you see, like smaller premises between 10,000 and 100,000 square foot, about 16% of their floor space is now put over to what is becoming A-grade office space. Now, even the larger sheds over 250,000 square foot, you still have about 4% of that space is over to A-grade office space. Now that's about 10,000 square foot, which is like a town centre office building. That's how big it is. And this is because a lot of these businesses now are co-locating their office, manufacturing, R&D and logistics space all in the one premises because it gives them economies of scale. So, you know, office co-location is really a big part of the industrial logistics sector now. So that's hopefully giving you a little bit of an introduction to the sector, what it's about. You know, now I'm going to sort of concentrate on why I think we should be trying to do as all participants in the planning process in this country, why I think it should be facilitated. I'm zeroing here very much on the economic argument. I'm a property economist. There's definitely other arguments to be in the mix, but this is my focus. So it's more on the economics. You know, I think the thing is here, you know, you start to see a lot about, well, you know, COVID and being in lockdown was why the sector just boomed. Well, it's not really. It's not it's a structural growth driver. It's not cyclical. And I think the need for industrial logistics is very much linked to the way we live our lives. You know, we shop online. We want our products same day, next day deliveries. This all requires a very efficient supply chain network in which these premises are a part. So that's why I said to you before, I believe it's critical national infrastructure. If I just move to the sort of the right there, every single freight mode in this country is predicted to grow. So, you know, you've got significant growth in traffic movement of goods, significant growth in air freight movement, in port and boat movement, and also rail movement. All of this is going to grow. Well, we're exporting and importing, and our country gets larger and more populated. All these growth modes are going to increase. You can't move kit around the country without these premises. This is what connects all these modes together. So as they grow, the need for more industrial logistics floor space will grow. It's also important protecting supply chains. We now know we're in a Brexit world. There's a lot of potential now. So a lot of companies now might have gone, well, I'm going to put my manufacturing in Eastern Europe because it's cheaper. Now there's war, there's Brexit, there's all these things. A lot of UK businesses are bringing their operations back to the UK. So they're not going to be impacted by supply chain breakages, whatever that is, war, political things, macroeconomics. So that again, that reshoring and nearshoring, bringing stuff back to the UK is also increasing the need for more floor space. And the other thing is a rise of e-commerce. You know, it really pushed up there. So I don't like to put the percentage of online retailing because that doesn't give you enough. What I'm showing you there is the total amount of money spent online, and it really popped up there. You've got that kind of big bump there in 2021. We're all in lockdown. It's come down a little bit, but it's predicted to grow. So even if online retail stayed at 25% that it is now of all retail spending, it's still going to increase in total expenditure because we're building more homes. But again, we expect actually online retail to grow from 25%. In fact, government is expecting it could be as high as 65% by 2050. So it's a major growth driver. I won't focus too much on this. This is more about the message, but there's a lot of misconceptions about this sector that it's low paid, low skilled. It's not. You know, these are all government statistics here. So the first one shows jobs in the logistics sector are growing twice the wider economy. So they've grown by 21% in the last 10 years or so versus 9% the economy as a whole. The top right-hand chart shows the major occupations in the UK and then puts how they're growing within the industrial logistics sector. And you can see basically the higher skilled professions are on the left-hand side, so managers, professional occupations, associate professional, and then they get lower skilled as you move along the right-hand axis. You can see most of the growth is happening in the most skilled jobs. So that is before it might have been, you know, Penelope as the floor manager getting me to drive my forklift around and stack boxes. Now that premises now is Penelope will need a supply chain manager, will need R&D people there, will need her HR people there. All these things, you need engineers to look at the automated processes. So they're a lot more diverse and high skilled professions. Bottom left-hand chart is just showing average pay in both logistics and manufacturing is between nearly 3,000 and 4,000 per annum higher than the all sector average. So jobs on average in this sector pay more than the all sector average. And then the next chart, I think it's better, I'll describe it over the next slide. I think, and it's fair, like a lot of planners will always go, well, if I build an office building here, it's going to give me more jobs than an industrial logistics building if it of the same size. That is true. Unfortunately, though, a lot of office jobs are paper jobs only because a lot of offices are not being built unless they're in a prime location. But I also think, you know, in the planning process, we're infatuated with just on-site jobs, whereas industrial logistics draws back a lot of that potential as part of its supply chains. So that's why in that grey box at the bottom, for every 10 on-site warehouse factory jobs created, another 7 to 12 are created off-site is part of the supply chain. So like if I'm in the middle there of that graphic at the top, I'm a premises, I've got stuff coming in on a port or an airway, it goes onto a rail, it goes onto trucks, they need to be serviced. There's all of this. Then there's last mile capability and delivery. Part of my supply chain, there's a lot of jobs generated there. And then just that final graphic there on the right is this thing called indirect GVA, which measures the contribution that each of those commercial sectors make on other businesses as part of their supply chain. And logistics has 2 times the sort of indirect GVA contribution than everything else. And that shows that those that are sitting there in an office today, that office doesn't function. There is bits and pieces in that office which are stored in an industrial logistics shed or manufactured somewhere for that office to run. And it just shows logistics plays a real role in sort of greasing the wheel of other sectors and allowing them to function. It's also an extremely resilient sector. I mean, obviously, not zeroing on this too much, but obviously last year was a bad year for households and businesses. We had cost of living crisis. We had everything going on. We had war. Despite that, the industrial logistics sector, so the demand at the end of the year was still 12% higher than the pre-COVID average, which is shown in that right-hand chart. So the total amount of demand accommodated was still 12% higher than the pre-COVID average, despite all those macroeconomic challenges. And then this year started off a lot better than last year. So it just shows how resilient this sector is. While other sectors were on their knees, retail, office, this sector's kept chugging along, even though the macroeconomics are kind of against it. So, obviously I've talked about the sector. Yes, it's got some strong economic credentials. It does have some challenges, very, very much so. But one thing I think in the planning system, I am a planner. A lot of my job is supporting planning applications, trying to get more sites allocated in local plans. That I do see, there is some issues with, the planning system. And I just think, the way we sort of estimate commercial needs in the planning system, they're not market facing. The main ones is we just project for past trends, or we just look at statistical models like Experian and all these others and just basically translate job growth into future needs. It doesn't really get under the bonnet of what is the market telling us. There's no market signals which are really enshrined in this, not in terms of the future demand estimates anyway. And this is a bit of an example. So this was from a major UK sort of government think tank. So yellow is where they predicted both manufacturing and logistic jobs would go when they estimated between 2012 and 2022 that manufacturing would decline by 6.7%. What actually happened, it increased by 4.1%. So the blue was the actual, the yellow was the government projection, the blue was actually what happened. So they thought manufacturing would decline by 6.7%. What actually happened, it grew by 4.1%. I see every evidence base up and down the country saying manufacturing's in decline. In reality, it's not. It's just had its strongest year in the last decade. Then for logistics, it said it would only grow 6.7%. It grew 23%. Bring those two together, it was negative 1.3% across them both. Projected, what actually happened was 11.2% growth. So these job estimates, I think, yes, they are one way of looking at it, but they are questionable in terms of their accuracy. And, a big reason for this is if we're trying to understand market demand, which is what we're trying to do in local plans and our evidence base, if we're trying to understand market demand, we need to look at what the market's telling us more, not just use statistical models as a representation. And, this just shows you some of the reality. So that the blue there is office availability. So in economic terms, in market terms, 8% availability is where supply and demand are generally at balance. We've got that balance for office, where you can see industrial logistics in England is well below that level and has been for a decade plus. When you have not enough supply to meet demand, you have strong rental growth as occupiers just keep, driving prices higher. That's why I&L is 76% rental growth in the last 10 years, whereas office is only 31% and not much higher than inflation. Then obviously you can see demand versus supply way bigger in I&L than it is for office. I'm just conscious of time, so I'll just really wrap up. I think one of the things too is this graph, it just shows how much industrial logistics floor space has been approved via appeal in England in the last 5 years. So this is sort of schemes that the planning system has turned its back on. So there's been 91 appeals allowed for industrial logistics in England in the last 5 years. That equates to 660 hectares and 21.5 million square foot that needed to be approved via appeal. These schemes support 21,000 jobs and 1.3 billion of GVA. So yeah, I just think, what can we do more to facilitate it? And just sort of finishing up, so Savills, rather than us sort of have a concern with the existing methods, we've come up with our own method, which is called Savills suppressed demand method. And what it does is just another way of looking at it. I'm not saying you should necessarily completely scrap these other methods like past take-up and labour demand, but they should be compared to a market-focused approach, which is what ours does. So what our model allows us to do is work out how much demand has been lost to an area because of historic supply constraints. Then we can add that to the historic trend, so what's actually happened, to give a more accurate demand profile into the future. And this is what we feel across England. There's 29% of demand in industrial logistics which has not found a home. It has not been able to find a home because of a lack of supply. So this is a method that we are using in a lot of big schemes up and down the country at the moment, and it's moving the right direction. It's been accepted by inspectors and local authorities up and down the country. So it's another way of looking at future commercial needs for industrial logistics. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and thank you for spotting the time. I was nervous about asking you to wrap up because I knew there was important stuff about planning at the end and wanted to make sure you covered that. We haven't got an overwhelming number of questions in the chat. Indeed, we haven't got any at all. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to ad-lib for a bit in case somebody does want to ask something, because I found that very interesting, very informative, because we don't often get that sort of macro level explaining about what the demand is. I'd love to ask some nerdy questions about how many sites there are in local plans and how many of those appeals were because they weren't allocated. But there aren't any questions in the chat, and nobody is actually putting any in. We've had a comment that it was very helpful. So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask Ryan to come straight in with your presentation, and then we'll see whether that stimulates any questions and debate. I noticed that our timetable in theory gives you 20 minutes, Ryan, but then it doesn't give any time for questions. So if you could try and do 15 minutes, and we're running a bit late. So yes, if you can finish about 20 past, that'd be fab.
Penelope, we have one question.
Oh, did we? It's come in. Has it arrived?
Yeah. Andrew, do you want to ask?
Let's carry it. Let's take Ryan, and then we'll come back to them. That and the others, I'm sure, that will come in as a result of Ryan.
Perfect. Thanks, Penelope. So yeah, I'm covering fairly similar ground to Mark, focusing on R&D and life sciences. There are some obvious differences between the sectors, but there is also some surprising overlap. So we'll get into that as we go. A bit about me: I'm an economics director in the Savills economics team. I'm based in Bristol. I'm sort of a provisional science and tech lead with the team, focusing on R&D schemes across our different service lines. So we, as Mark sort of covered, we support planning applications with sort of evidence-based market assessment. We also work with councils and government on sort of economic development strategies, strategic research. We prepare business cases and funding bids for things like levelling up bids. We undertake market analysis for developers and investors to help them identify opportunities for development across the country in a variety of sectors. And we do a lot of sort of growth strategy and viability work. So what I'll be covering today is I'll be looking at, well, the main of my presentation will be the market trends and demand for R&D. And I think that's probably the main thing you want Savills to come in and talk to you about. But I'll be touching on the economic case for investment into R&D as well, and like how that links into the levelling up objectives and economic regeneration. And then I'll be summarising some planning solutions that our planning team have been advocating to the government on. And I appreciate something that might be a little controversial, but hopefully as a good discussion point for the Q&A. So begin with market trends. The life science and R&D sector has, as a result of COVID-19, been thrown into the spotlight, and a huge amount of investment was made in the sector, both in the real estate, but then in the companies themselves via venture capital investment from VCs across the world. This was because vaccine discovery was a mission critical strategy for getting us out of the pandemic, but then also there's broader trends like population aging, growing demand for new types of healthcare. So and to reduce the cost of this. So there's a wide variety of trends and influences into the sector. What we're seeing is a diversity of real estate need being required, and it includes obviously lab spaces, but then also a lot of manufacturing space as well to support the supply chain. The main challenges is from a real estate perspective is that stock isn't being delivered fast enough. There's particularly during COVID. There are a range of reasons for that. It's very high cost, lab space, very high cost relative to office buildings, for instance, or iron ore sheds. There've been a few issues with the planning, but then also because of the rapid expansion in the sector, there's a lot of new entrants, a lot of new development entrants. So there are issues around the knowledge of how to develop and operate these types of facilities. So there's a wide range of issues around dealing with stock, and that's led to very tight vacancy rates and availability rates across Cambridge and Oxford, which are obviously the main markets.
I'm just going to interrupt you, Ryan.
Yes.
Have you got any colleagues near you that are talking? Because there's some feedback on the call and no one else has got their mics on. I'm just wondering if there is someone talking near you. Could you ask them to pipe down for the next 10 minutes?
I'm in a busy office. Unfortunately not. I can move to a meeting room if you just give me 2 seconds. That might be...
feedback from anyone else on the call? Is anyone else finding the slight noise an issue, or should we just crack on? I will count to 3 and see.
I am.
You're finding it an issue?
Yeah, I can't really.
Yeah, okay. If you wouldn't mind popping into a mini office,
Yeah, me too.
We'll take the questions for Mark and carry on doing that. Thank you very much, Ryan. Appreciate that. So we had some questions in the chat. We had one from Andrea. Andrea, do you want to pop your mic on? And you are asking about the biggest barrier to logistics.
I've actually got 2 questions. As the logistics sector is growing so rapidly, what is the biggest barrier in the planning system and why? Is it lack of knowledge or general perception? Or the second question is, if the logistics sector is growing so rapidly, is the support network for the logistics sector on our motorways, for lorries, pull-ins, places for lorries to rest, is that growing at the same rate as the logistics sector? It's very pertinent to me for the A40. That's why I'm asking. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Really good questions. The first one, I think there's politics out there. I think the major barriers, there is people that have a lot of misconceptions about this sector. They see big sheds, they see traffic, they don't want it. They perceive it's low skilled, low density. There's some of that which is just completely wrong, which I think I've got in the presentation. The jobs are good, they pay better, it's high skilled, it's fast growing. Yes, it does create traffic. We can't work away from that, and that needs to be worked through the planning process and make sure only the right schemes and the right sites and the right locations come forward. But I put a lot of the issue for me is the way we assess commercial needs. We shouldn't be using just Experian or whoever to give us a job count for a local area and then translate that to a need case. We shouldn't just be looking at past trends and projecting that forward. We should be looking at the market more to give us answers. And that's why we've come up with our own model. It's not to say everything else is rubbish and you only need to use the Savills method, but we feel it's a better way at looking at the market to give us answers. I'm also, I am a MRTPI planner. This is not saying some of the demand out there in some locations in this sector is insatiable, and I wouldn't expect a local authority to be able to accommodate all the demand out there. But what I think we should see is, before you do your call for sites and decide what sites you like, you should do your need case, right? And say, look, this is the number. How much of that number can we accommodate against our competing priorities like housing and protecting the green belt and doing commercial facilities? How much can we accommodate of that against all our other competing priorities? And then you do your call for sites to see what sites you've got available to match up. So yeah, I see we've got to get our methods a bit better at estimating future demand. And your other point about truck facilities and parking facilities, we've got one of the worst. We're far below Europe in terms of truck parking facilities and roadside services than Europe. So there's a lot of the big schemes I'm working on now are carving off space to do that. And I think it should be planned for. That there's a guy that I see quite a lot at planning examinations. No one listens to him about getting, truck facilities into local plans and getting sites to that. It is because it falls outside a typical use class, right? So it's unplanned for. But it is very, very important that we capture this. And I think a lot of the industrial logistics developers are now putting forward some of their site for these truck facilities. But you've also got to understand there isn't enough of the facilities themselves for industrial logistics. So it's to me a separate thing that needs to be planned for, linked to INL rather than just lumping it in together. That makes sense.
That's a really helpful reply. Now, Brian, how are you getting on? Oh, you're on mute.
Apologies.
Looks like, now we can see ourselves. Getting close.
Yep, all good. Great.
Okay, brilliant. If you can go again, great. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. So I think, as I was saying, hopefully picked up most of what I was saying, but why is science and R&D a relevant sector for local planning authorities and the economy more generally? COVID-19 propelled the sector into the spotlight. Getting a vaccine developed was really mission critical to getting us out of pandemic, and that resulted in a huge amount of venture capital being invested into the sector. There are broader trends and issues as well, like the aging population, which means that there's now pressure to make healthcare more affordable and focused on extending quality of life. And that's also driving a huge amount of investment into the life science sector. Data-driven health solutions, AI, drug discovery, health tech, they're now growing as a subsector of life sciences, and that will have implications for the type of real estate that's needed to service the sector. There's huge economic development potential that's being noted in the Levelling Up program and via investment zones that could potentially help regenerate parts of the country that have traditionally lacked private sector investment. So there's a whole range of reasons why the science and R&D sector has had so much attention over the last few years, and it's been seen as not only just a real estate sector, but really important to our health and well-being as a society, but also economic development for parts of the country. So just some I'll touch slightly on some broad market trends that ourselves we've observed over the last year or so. There's our agency team in Oxford and Cambridge have observed there's a huge unmet requirement for demand. In 2023, there's 2.1 million square feet of unmet requirements. So that's a lot of take up sitting on the sidelines, waiting for the right real estate to take up. There's occupiers are focusing on R&D clinical trials, so that triple helix ecosystem is really important with local, with teaching hospitals and universities. Fitted space tends to be the focus for occupiers rather than shell and core, and there's a premium, fairly strong and growing premium for that type of space. There is a growing demand for urban and city centre locations, and that's not to say that science parks are, there's no demand for science parks. There's still, for particular science parks, there's huge amounts of demand, but we're finding that as it's becoming more of a tech-focused sector, the need for amenity and good transport connections is becoming a priority. And we're even finding, we did a survey of scientists a year or so ago to effectively, ask them what they wanted, and that was a key requirement for them. It has a growing development pipeline, as I'm sure you're all aware. Being local planning officers in the ARC, there's a lot of development and planning activity, but a lot of them are still with planning or pre-planning, so deliveries aren't as strong as they need to be. So I think that some of the implications of this, is that the immediate stock availability is quite low, and that's suppressing take-up. So similar to what Mark was saying about the I&L market, but we're finding that historic take-up, or some of the ways in which evidence-based documents are forecasting need, aren't really picking up some of the suppressed demand that we think exists in the market. And last year, even though there's demand was still quite strong, we did see a drop off in venture capital within life sciences. That's now seems to be reversing. So for 2023, for a full year, there was 12.9 billion pounds invested into life sciences across the UK. For the first half of this year, it's 10.9 billion. So we're seeing an improvement in capital invested. So what do we mean by R&D and science real estate? So it really runs the gamut from office space that's targeted at R&D and life science tenants, to incubator and fitted labs, which are usually provided by universities, and target spin out and startup companies. Wet labs, which are where biotech companies work on research and development and discovery. Dry labs, more focused on tech and AI, might have a supercomputer in them and have high electricity capacity to facilitate that. Manufacturing and supply chain. So as Mark was saying, that the I&L sector increasingly seeing other forms of use classes and types of tenants being located in them. That's certainly the case. And the manufacturing facilities really run the gamut from very specialized facilities designed to produce clinical trial batches, which require a lot of scientists and human intervention in them, to more commercial scaled up spaces, which are GMP facilities and designed to produce at scale. We are seeing sort of an affordable alternative. So as I was saying before, there was significant undersupply of lab space. That's increasing, resulting in increased rents. We are seeing a more affordable, more flexible type of stock called mid-tech come to market. It's not a new type of stock. It's been around for a while, but it's increasingly used as an affordable alternative. And I think particularly where tenants need a mix of R&D, office, and light industrial and distribution uses on site. So, Harwell campus in Oxfordshire are developing a mix of this type of stock on their campus. Milford Park as well, and Bourne Quarter in Cambridge. When we look at the demand for, or try to sort of look at the demand for life science and R&D stock, we start with venture capital flows. So it provides sort of what I'd call market tone, and where investor investment sentiment is presently at. As I said before, quarter one this year, we saw an uptick in VC raise compared to 2023. And while there was very robust demand from the market and tight availability, we did note that there was a dip in venture capital investment compared to the peak periods in COVID. Oxford, for instance, saw a fivefold increase over the quarter, and saw an increase in quite a large increase in its deal size. So indicates that there's significantly more money being raised by individual companies now as well. Interesting enough, though, that there's we noted a trend in the type of capital, not the type of capital, the type of companies raising venture capital within the life science sector. Increasingly, we're seeing digital health, health tech, AI-powered drug discovery being an increasingly important part of the life science mix. And that's really, if you want to just dumb it down, it's really taking large data sets of health demographic data, and making it very easy for life science companies to access that, analyze it, and use it to create life science pharmaceutical solutions to health issues. And so we're seeing, last year we saw about 13 billion raised, VC raised within that sector. In terms of the type of space and real estate needed to meet that need, it's probably more on the dry lab end of the spectrum. Well located in urban location, so more of a tech focused occupier base looking for that sort of type of product. In terms of how this is distributed across the UK, I mean, you can the Golden Triangle is still very much the centre of the UK's R&D ecosystem. You can see from this map we've mapped life science spinouts and venture capital from, I think it was from 2022, and each dot represents the size of each dot represents the size of each deal. And what it shows is that there's a huge amount of investment still into Cambridge, Oxford, and London, and also the clusters in between. However, you can see regional clusters evolving, and I think there is those regional clusters are increasingly seeing lab development. They do tend to be subject to worse viability conditions. I mean, they can't charge as high market rent. Yet they still have the same construction costs. So there's much more government funding being put into them, but it's definitely a growing market for a number of these regional cities. And I mean, in Glasgow today, doing some work with the University of Glasgow and on their sort of innovation district, and some really impressive facilities and anchor tenants up here that could really anchor their plans to develop a sort of R&D and life science cluster. So lots of really interesting things happening in the regional areas, but still the private sector investment is still very much focused in the ARC and London. This is reflected in jobs growth. So here we've charted life science jobs, both the existing jobs and then the growth of jobs. So obviously the further up that square you are, the high number of jobs and jobs growth that you have. So you see Cambridge and Oxford are very much still the fastest growing local authorities in that respect. However, you see Thames Valley local authorities, so like Reading and Swindon, for instance, up there, Glasgow, Bristol, also key regional centres that have attracted growth in life sciences. So real estate has played a really important part of growing these clusters, and it will continue to play a really important part. But the type of space really needs to be matched with the type of occupier and that the phase of development of your market. So obviously Cambridge and Oxford, there's this demand across the spectrum. Particularly the corporate, big pharma, big tech companies. So there's more demand for specialist space and self-contained space, and they'll tend to want to have their own sort of fit out and own design tailored around what they need specifically. The rest of the market is a bit more diverse, and what you'll see is that typically a new ecosystem will start from universities, and that will usually be space co-located on campus, and then grows into spin-outs, startup incubators, and then to multi-let grow-on space. However, it really takes the right ecosystem to facilitate this. Typically that the triple helix ecosystem model is what is used. I'd argue there needs to be an additional element to that, which is placemaking, housing, and supporting infrastructure. There's lots of really good examples where you see bottlenecks in those supporting, enabling elements of an ecosystem, constraining the rest of it. But access to talent is really important. A well-developed ecosystem with teaching hospitals, incubator support facilities, universities, research bodies, and amenities are needed, and obviously lower cost housing for graduates and researchers. So what does that look like? one way you can look at that is the growth in spin-out activity. So what I mean by spin-out activity is academic spin-outs coming out of university. So that's where a company, a researcher or a student has commercialized their own intellectual property and research and spun it out into a company. And so what we've seen is that over time, there has been quite strong growth across the UK. So quite an impressive growth from 10 years ago, but increasingly that is being focused within the Golden Triangle. So I think it's from sort of 36% in 2013 to 40% in 2023 of the UK's spin-outs are located or come from Oxford, Cambridge, and London. So that just reflects some of the other trends I was talking about earlier, where while there are opportunities in other regional cities, a lot of the private investment is still being funneled into the Golden Triangle. Here we go. So despite that growth, I would still say, and this is probably less of a planning point and more just a general point about life science and R&D. The UK, while an extremely smart country with a huge, quite a lot of publications per $1 billion of GDP compared to other countries, very little of that is actually translated into patent publications. So that there's something not quite working with the commercialization of IP from universities, and that's despite seeing quite strong growth in spin-outs. There's still, I'd say, a latent opportunity there to really tap into the UK's intellectual property through its universities to commercialize and grow sort of a local R&D and life science company base. Some of the issues around that are to do with, there's obviously a real estate angle, which I've talked about, but there's other drivers as well. And so the financing of commercializing IP is a real constraint on that in the UK. So the chart on the left shows the average deal size of spin-outs in the UK versus the United States. And so the dark blue is the United States and the yellow is the UK. And you see, even though the UK has grown over time, similar to the amount of spin-outs being spun out, there's still a huge gap in the average deal size, and that has to do with the access to capital, and I'd say also probably the investment culture in the United States compared to the UK. And then the chart on the right is it shows what the equity stake a university takes in the spin-out to support it through its incubation phase. So this has to do with the on-campus support that universities provide spin-outs. There's quite a large amount of equity taken by universities on average, and that reduces the ability for spin-outs to then use that equity to raise additional funds later down the track. So that there's a few issues with how financing is of spin-outs is undertaken in the UK.
I wonder, Ryan, if I can ask you to begin to wrap up.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just the slides. So however, on the real estate side, the real estate angle to this as well is that we do tend to undersupply our markets here relative to global competition. So the chart on the left shows Cambridge lab supply compared to venture capital, compared to sort of our competing US cities, and shows that there's significantly low lab space compared to venture capital being generated. And then but however, the viability of labs compared to office spaces is growing, and compared to other global comparators, we've actually got a reasonably viable rental rate. So viability is becoming less of a problem, but we're still having issues with lab supply. Part of the problem is that even though our pipeline's grown, much of it's still subject to planning or with consent. So there's a fairly large scale amount of projects, but a few issues with getting through the system. And similar to what Mark was saying, we've been running his model on for iron or suppressed demand on the lab market. And what we're finding is that actually the suppressed demand for labs is about 2 times as high as the historic net absorption rates. So what that's telling us is that the lack of supply, if you accept the assumptions of the model, is really constraining demand and what demand could be. And so there's some issues around that. So sorry, everyone, I'll just finish there. I appreciate I've run out of time. I don't want to take anyone else's speaking time, but I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A at the end if anyone has any further questions.
Thank you very much, Ryan. And it wasn't helpful that you had to relocate during, and we're grateful that you did. It was much clearer once you were in the room. So we have got quite a few questions in the chat, which I'm keen that we take. So be grateful if your answers can be quite focused. Helen Harding, you had a question about the use of Savills approach by local planning authorities and in appeals. Do you want to pop on your mic and ask your question?
Hi everyone, I'm just really interested in that suppressed demand approach, coming from an area with a lot of greenbelt constraints historically, and I've come across one document referring to the methodology. It's been said that it has been accepted by some councils and inspectors, and I'm just really interested to find out where. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. So yeah, it's been it was used in the SEMLEP study. South East Midlands Local Enterprise Partnership did a strategic industrial study. That wasn't done by us, but the methodology was used by another consultant in that. I've used the model personally to get a site allocated in Crawley. It supported a site into draft allocation in South Staffs, another one up in Wigan. It is being used, I also believe, as one of the methods in the West Midlands Strategic Site Study. I've been leading on the needs case for the Hinckley National Rail Freight Interchange, so suppressed demand has been used for that project, and it will be for another DCO I'm about to work on. So yes, it's new, it's thought leadership. Have we been getting objections to it along the way? This is not the way we've always done it. Yes, but if you ask my professional view, it's needed to go into the debate. A lot of planning authorities and your elected members might not like the answer, but I feel if you're going to try and understand market demand, you should be looking at the market, not other methods. So yes, it's got traction. We still have a way to go.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Hayley Jeffrey, you were asking a question about appeals. Mark, you set out how many schemes were being allowed on appeal, but you didn't talk about how many were refused. Hayley, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I suppose it was just to get a balanced view, if there is a balanced view, or it might be completely one way, and inspectors might be, really supportive of this sector and actually aren't dismissing that many appeals. So I just thought if Savills had the stats for how many were allowed, they might have the other side of the coin. It might just paint a picture either way.
It's a really good question, and I'm delving into my memory here. On that stat, it was sometimes around, it was about 65% were allowed. Okay, and it's a really good question. I think the need case as being that I and others are presenting up and down the country is gaining real traction. A lot of the schemes are being refused on landscape grounds and other kind of impacts, not so much the need case. So I think it was about a 65% appeal allowed in that 5-year data that we've got there. And increasingly, one of the big reasons for refusal is visual impact, landscaping, that kind of thing, less so the need case, which I think, we present and others present very evidential things. A lot of planners by their nature are evidential led. So the need case is at a technical level being accepted, but there is these other issues which these schemes do have, and they are leading to refusals as well.
Thank you very much.
That's useful. Thank you.
Now, Howard Albertini. Howard, we haven't spoken for about 20 years. It's nice to see you on the call. You've asked a second question, which someone else has given a thumbs up to. So let's make sure we answer that, which is about the resilience of the buildings. Do these buildings end up being bespoke, and then when it's no use, it has to be taken down? I'm sort of riffing a little bit on Howard's question. Or can you use refit old buildings? How much is there building versatility design in the buildings? Howard, do you want to add something to that? Or indeed, Catherine, because you put the thumbs up, Catherine Pierce. Silent. So Howard's saying no thanks. So Mark, would you like to, or indeed Ryan, which of you would like to take that question?
Sorry, Penelope, could you just repeat that for me?
Does need for fitted lab space mean bespoke building design, or is it practical to fit within normal R&D office type buildings? In other words, are we having to build new buildings, And once you've built them, can they only be used for that purpose, or can we build adaptable buildings that can be shifted from one use to another?
It's a really good question. I think I think there've been some challenges with adapting office buildings to R&D. I think, you know, the specification of a lab building, particularly, you know, if it's a wet lab, you know, is just completely different to an office building. So I think, you know, the floor to ceiling, you know, heights, you know, the ventilation required, you know, the waste disposal, the access, all very different to a typical office building. So I think, while there might be some exceptions to that, I think it has been more challenging than I think some people hoped. I think, you know, particularly given the office market struggled, you know, it'd be a very neat solution to that. You know, being able to just switch an office building up to a wet lab space. That might be different for dry labs. So, you know, I was talking a bit about in my presentation that the growth in health tech and AI enabled discovery of vaccines and medicine. That type of use would be more compatible with an existing office building. But I think, you know, particularly for, you know, if you're talking about a self-contained, purpose-built lab building, you know, for a large corporate, they're probably going to want to build their own building. Might be different for. I have seen it work well for incubator space, where the lab specifications are a bit more standardized. They're not as purpose-built, and they because they are spin outs and they are startups. Yeah, they can't really afford to be as picky, and yeah, they'll tend to, you know, shove them into a, you know, a bit more of a standardized lab build. Yeah. So that's my take on it.
That's very helpful. And a very quick response, please. And Michael, forgive me, I'm not going to give you the chance to come in. Michael Moore's asked a question about building size, and buildings generally seem to need to be bigger and taller. Is that true, or are we just imagining it? Mark or Ryan, quick answer.
Building sizes for both, like INL and R&D, or
for either.
Both. Yeah. It's a good question. I'd have to give it some thought and look back at some of my you know, some of my reports. It's Mark, not something that's.
What's your view, Mark? They're getting bigger? You're on mute.
Can you repeat the question, or you were breaking up a little bit there?
Let me find the actual. Are warehouses getting bigger and taller over time, and what size of premises is the market generally seeking?
Look, they're definitely getting bigger, like 100%. They are getting bigger. You know, it's fair to say 10 years ago, 100,000 was a big building. It's not that big now. You know, you have buildings in the 200s, 300s, 500,000 plus. You've had some Amazon buildings which are over 2 million square foot, and this is part of the challenges, which I completely appreciate. Yeah. These are land hungry, big structures, and they need to be tall as well for the racking systems. Yeah, so definitely getting bigger.
Yeah, it leads to I sound like an old fogey when I say it'd be nice to have some regional planning, and we can actually sort this on a bigger basis rather than each local authority having to deal with this. But that's opening up a whole new.
Absolutely, I could not agree with you more.
And we've got David very patiently sitting, waiting to give us a presentation on energy. There's a nice link actually to this, because another question that Howard asked and a question that Andrea has asked is about diesel costs and net zero and all the rest, which I'm going to sort of skate over because we've got David going to speak now. But I would make one observation by way of introduction to David, in that if we were serious about taking our embodied energy costs of buildings into account, we might find it was easier to adapt buildings than to have to build new ones. But because at the moment we don't really take that properly into account systematically in the same way across the whole of England, we don't take that as a factor before we decide whether a building is obsolete or we have to build a new one. David, you're not really talking about that. You're talking about energy use in warehouses and lighting and heating and refrigeration and so forth. So tell us what we need to know about energy for logistics. Thank you very much.
Hopefully you can see it's come up on your screen.
Yeah, that's lovely.
I first of all say I'm not a logistics warehouse person particularly, but I've been in the energy business probably 30 plus years now, and I think to some extent there is a fashion element to energy, as we are, and I worked at DMU, De Montfort University, and they reduced a tower block to concrete and then rebuilt it. So they got an old building, but paid 2/3 of a price for a new building. And they did that because of sustainability issues. And obviously, if you're designing your building through a concrete skeleton, you are limited to your ceiling heights. And so they made that work, but that requires quite a bit of commitment. And they ended up with a really good building that's the centerpiece of their new campus. But you've got to be quite brave to do that. I'm conscious of time, and when do you want me to finish? In about 5 minutes?
If you can have about 8.
8, okay.
She says generously.
Right, okay. Could you interrupt me, because I've got a 2-screen system here and I can't see what's going on with. So if you want to interrupt, please do so.
Okay.
Who knows about energy? I think we all know about energy. This person might know a little bit more because he's just spent 8 hours chasing an antelope. And the antelope is not dead in that picture, but it's shortly to be. And they found it's to do with control of energy, that you can actually walk more efficiently on 2 legs than 4. So you can actually outpace an antelope, obviously at a slower pace, but you have got to do it for a long time. But also the antelope in a desert has got quite a lot of heat to get rid of, and it's got a coat, so it overheats in a way that, although it's hot, the human doesn't. So the 2 aspects of heating is actually not just keeping warm, but also getting rid of heat. And with refrigeration also being part of warehouses and R&D, that is a factor to consider. Looking just at warehouses, and this is a warehouse and logistics guide that the Carbon Trust put up. If you just put those words in at the bottom, it'll come up, because the URL was quite long. And so this isn't looking at R&D, and so what I'm covering is quite limited. But for warehouses, and this isn't to do with the office element of warehouses, although it's got some office lighting in, it's the lighting is generally the biggest item. That can halve or more once you put LEDs in. So that's a big issue. And then the other biggies are for warehouses is the heating and how you move stuff around. The battery charging is for the forklift trucks. I'm not going to talk any more about lighting on the basis that I think lots of people are now going forward to put in LEDs, and that's the rigor. But you do get lots of variations in how especially with R&D is where your energy is used. So it's rather difficult to say. But so I'm concentrating here on warehouses. So you've got your heat system. The issue for your heating system is you've got to decide whether you're going to go for what I call ordinary space heating or radiant heating. Radiant heating is where you've got your doors open a lot of the time. And that's the sort of warehouse that you would perhaps is running a garage. And some garages don't even have doors to them because the in and out's so quick. Because of this variation, or if I just go back to that screenshot, that is a typical, but it is not necessarily the building that you're looking at. So you do need metering to pick up where your biggies are, because where your big energy use, that's where you're going to spend your time. So if for instance heat loss is the big the big one, then you might look at these fast acting doors that shut down quickly. In time, cooling is bound to grow for people as we get warmer days, because certainly the big boxes you can get overheating. We're looking at heating here. So the issue is, do you use space heating or radiant heating? And I've previously mentioned that radiant is where you've got a lot of air or high ventilation rates. For heating space, you can use warm air radiator or fan coils. Those basically heat the air in some shape or form. The heat losses you get is partly to do with how the building's made. As Mark mentioned about the buildings 30, 40 years ago will probably leak like a sieve, and you'll lose significant heat through all of these, whereas the more modern buildings are much better sealed up, and the heating will be a lot less. The way that the level of heating that you do need is partly determined by the controls. So and one aspects of that is which looks at the temperature outside and the temperature inside, and starts up at a different time every day to get to a set temperature for when people start work. One of the things I was going to look at briefly was about heat pumps. The heat pumps are quite clever bits of kit, but they are more complicated, and you've just got to be a bit more careful. You don't just rip a boiler out and put a heat pump in. They can be quite useful, especially for the smaller areas, because all you need is electricity. If I can just take a minute of your time to talk through this, the diagram, because if I say a heat pump is a fridge in reverse, I don't find that's not always helpful, because not everyone understands how a fridge works. But effectively, a heat pump boils, but a boiler doesn't boil. And a heat pump has to boil. At low pressure, it boils a refrigerant. And that's and the importance of that is if you boil your kettle, you'll not get, if you put a temperature in your thermometer in your kettle, it won't go above 100 degrees C. And that feature of putting heat into the kettle, but it's being at the same temperature, is an important aspect of a heat pump. So you boil the liquid, you then compress it, and then you pull out the heat from the system by unboiling it. The posh term is condensing it, but I think unboiling makes it a bit clearer. So you boil and you unboil in a heat pump, as you do in a refrigeration cycle air conditioning unit. Mark has mentioned about it, you've got a lovely roof there for putting PVs on, and I would fully agree. What you do need for PVs, though, is you need a sufficient load. If you can use the load on site, you get 28p or 30p a kilowatt hour. If you're giving it to the grid, you'll get something like 6p. I won't go through that list, but if it's the information sent out, you'll be able to go read it. Logistics, I know very little about logistics, but essentially it's trying to keep your miles down by and also you're driving more efficiently by a smoother driving style. I'm not looking into the fuels, although that was a discussion, because obviously there's the dilemma of what fuels do we use for HGVs, and there's a lot of discussion about that I'm not at the cutting edge of. Presently, we're on to diesel, there's talk of hydrogen. I'm not sure whether anyone's. We've got buses that are electric, but I think HGVs are just too heavy for electric to work out at present. And I think I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that your time got so compressed, David, but very helpful. A few thoughts about the difficulties of or some of the issues around energy and logistics. Would you like to stop your screen share completely?
Yep. Sorry.
That's okay. Excellent. So we've just got a few minutes left. No more questions have come up in the chat, but let's go back to this one that I slightly skated across, which was Howard's question about diesel costs and Andrea's question about net zero. I'm now just looking through the chat. So Howard's question on diesel costs was, if diesel costs rise, say 20% above inflation long term, what effect does this have on warehouse location decisions? And let me just find Andrea's question. How much impact does the net zero agenda have on future-proofing this sector versus increased costs of current delivery? So just as a final wrap-up, if all three of you would like to make some comment on those final two questions. I'm going to pick on Mark first.
I'd say without a shadow of a doubt, net zero is arguably, well, it's one of the most important, if not arguably the most important. And I think that there's a lot the sector needs to do, which is, you know, decarbonising their supply chains, investing in net zero and everything they need to do. What planning can do is allocate sites in the right locations. That's what planning can do. It's, you know, they need to be on near motorway junctions. They need to be in accessible locations. We need to make sure they're near major conurbations. They're near strategic rail freight interchanges, and that is less distance carried, yeah, which will help. The industry has to do a lot. Now, I see them, I work with a lot of the big players, the Seagrows, the St. Modwins, the Prologists, et cetera, et cetera. They are all grappling with this and seriously looking to invest in it, but there's a lot on their side of the ledger that they're going to have to keep doing. So, yeah, it's a two-way street.
Ryan, have you got anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think it's definitely challenging for most of the commercial market, and I think one of the maybe the promising things is that as an investment class, it has grown in popularity, and there is we've seen it and it's not just net zero, it's in sort of social value and a broader view of being developing buildings that are benefit the environment and people. We have seen sort of some improvement in that as a class. So I think while there is obviously a risk of greenwashing in that, and that's obviously something everyone's aware of. That it is a promising sign that there is increasing amount of ESG focused funds. How that translates into the actual development of schemes. I think the macroeconomic conditions in the last few years have not helped. The huge cost inflation associated with the supply chain disruptions. I think it's just meant that it's been put in the too high basket for a lot of developers, or given a fairly sort of light touch nod to. So there are some challenges, but hopefully we see a bit more growth in that sort of ESG investment class.
And David.
Well, I mean, I don't have an aversion to a high energy price. If you get a professional cyclist for 40 hours a week, they get paid around about £10 a week for the energy. We have very cheap energy. So I think it's no bad thing to have to treat energy as a high value item. Obviously, that changes when you're worried about people who can't heat themselves or can't cook. But that aside, I think we should. So if if you're ordering a part and it costs twice as much to deliver to you, then maybe you should pay a post and package rather than have free post and packaging, so that you do understand a little bit more about the on cost. I have this dilemma, but obviously how you differentiate between those who desperately need energy in houses that are really the poorest in Europe to heat, that's a slightly different argument.
And we have one last question in the chat, again from Howard. Thank you very much, Howard, for keeping us employed today. Howard asks, more PV on warehouse roof, is extra weight a cost issue, i.e. cost more than saving through the use of PV energy on site or sale of it? Mark, I think you were the one that mentioned this.
There is that as a factor. It is extra weight, but I believe it is being more accurately pursued because it's been aggressively pursued because the numbers stack up for doing it. So a lot of the real modern schemes I'm doing now are doing this because every company occupier that is going into this, ESG is so critical to them, and they don't get contracts unless they can demonstrate they are a green company. And the best way you do that is demonstrate the premises you occupy are green, and this is part of the answer. So I think the numbers stack up.
That's really good to know, and it would be very sad if we found we were building lots and lots of roofs and then having to stick lots of PVs on the farmland next door rather than on the roof of the big building we've just built. It would be a tragedy if we just couldn't make it work. So it's great to hear that it does actually work. So we're coming to time. Thank you all very much for your questions. Those of you that are listening to this, thank you very much for Ryan, Mark and David. I'm sorry about the disruption, Ryan, to asking you to move, but it was better for it. Thank you all very much for coming. Now, Maura, do you want to say anything about our upcoming BOBMK events before we close?
We were hoping to go to Harwell and look at the Harwell site with South Oxon. I think following this, we'll probably investigate that a little bit further, because I think we obviously got a good interest in logistics, and I know that that's been a very successful site. We would still like your feedback on where you would like to go. We also want to go and visit King's Cross in London, because there's a lot of new development there, which has been very well received, and that includes R&D, office space, and a wide variety of nice public realms. So they're the sort of two areas we're thinking of. But, please do let me know where you'd like to go, and we'll see what we can do. Unfortunately, we're struggling to go to Pownbury because we can't get those to respond to us no matter what we try. So unless anyone's got a magic wand, then sadly, I don't think we're going to make it to Pownbury this summer.
Thank you very much, Maura. So I hope you all know Maura's email address. Could you just pop it in the chat, Maura, so that everyone can make sure they can get in touch with you? We haven't got a poll today. Those of you that are regular BOBMK people know we quite often have polls, but we weren't quite sure what questions to ask you, so we didn't bother with one today. So finally, I'll thank again our three speakers. Thank you all very much for coming, and see you again hopefully on a future BOBMK event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks all.